Nineveh, the crown jewel of the ancient world. Sennacherib built a city of unmatched architectural splendor.
Knowledge was the ultimate power of the Assyrian kings.
Today, the ruins tell a story of eternal resilience.
Around the year 700 before Christ, Nineveh had become the largest city in the known world. Capital of the Assyrian Empire, center of power, commerce, and knowledge, it stretched along the eastern bank of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. A colossal metropolis, surrounded by walls that seemed to have no end, ruled by kings who proclaimed themselves lords of the universe. Within its gates rose palaces lined with stone reliefs that told stories of conquest, gardens that some believe were among the wonders of the ancient world, and a library that contained the accumulated knowledge of millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. In barely a century, everything we see here would disappear beneath fire, plunder, and oblivion. In this video, I use modern artificial intelligence tools to bring historical paintings, maps, and ancient engravings to life, changing perspectives, adjusting camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original creators could never have imagined. The goal is not merely to observe the past, but to step into it, to walk through Nineveh as it once was, and to try to imagine what it would have meant to stand here in the heart of the most powerful empire the world had known up to that time. And if you stay until the end, we will compare these same places with their appearance today to see what has changed and what still remains. Before we set foot in ancient Nineveh, it is worth understanding how this story began. The site where the great capital would rise had been inhabited for millennia. Long before the Assyrians claimed it as their own, a small Neolithic settlement existed by the river. And over the centuries that place grew into a cult center dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, the deity of love and war, whose presence would shape Nineveh's identity throughout its existence. The Akkadians left their mark there during the reign of Sargon the Great, and the Hurrians controlled the region for a time. But Nineveh had to wait until the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire to reach its true greatness. It was the warrior kings of Assyria who transformed it from a provincial town into the capital of an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf. And it was one king in particular, Sennacherib, who decided that Nineveh would be his masterpiece, a place so magnificent that the whole world would remember his name. When Sennacherib ascended the throne around the year 705 before Christ, he immediately abandoned his father's capital, Ur-Sharrukin. That city, built by Sargon II over a decade of monumental effort, was considered ill-fated after the ignominious death of its creator in battle, and the new king wanted nothing to do with it. He moved the seat of power to Nineveh, where he had already resided as crown prince. What he found there was an ancient city, but modest for his ambitions. An old palace was slowly sinking into marshy ground, undermined by the floods of the Kosa River that ran through the city. Sennacherib ordered the deteriorating palace demolished, the marshes drained through canals, and upon the reclaimed land he built a new residence that would reflect the absolute power of his reign. What he constructed over the following years would turn Nineveh into an unprecedented metropolis. He laid out new streets and squares, erected double walls on a scale few had seen before, and designed a system of canals that brought water from the mountains more than 50 kilometers away to nourish gardens, parks, and the daily life of a population that may have exceeded 100,000 people. Nineveh was not only a center of government, it was a declaration of absolute power, built to impress and to intimidate anyone who approached its gates. We now stand before the city walls, and the scale is difficult to comprehend. The full perimeter stretched for approximately 12 kilometers, enclosing an area of about 750 hectares. The foundations were made of carved limestone blocks rising several meters high, above which mud brick walls climbed even higher, reaching a total height that some estimated at nearly 50 meters, with a thickness in certain sections exceeding 25. Watchtowers dotted the entire circuit, forming a defensive line that from a distance must have appeared almost continuous. A moat and an outer embankment added another layer of protection. 15 great gates pierced these walls, each one not only an entry point, but an architectural statement in its own right. The Kosa River crossed the city from east to west before flowing into the Tigris, dividing the urban space and providing an additional artery for transport and commerce. For any traveler, merchant, or envoy approaching the city, the message was clear before even crossing the first gate. This was the center of the world, and the power that ruled it had no equal. As we approach one of these gates, the first thing that captures the eye is the colossal figures flanking the entrance. These are the Lamassu, guardian creatures carved from enormous blocks of alabaster with the body of a bull, the wings of an eagle, and a bearded human head crowned with a horned tiara, symbol of their divinity. Each of these figures weighed several tons and had been carved from a single block that must have been transported from distant quarries on sledges pulled by dozens of men, a logistical feat proudly recorded in the palace reliefs themselves. The sculptors gave them 5 legs, an ingenious device that made the creature appear firmly planted when viewed from the front, yet striding forward when seen from the side. Their function was both practical and symbolic. They supported the gateway arch, but at the same time were believed to repel evil forces and prevent any malicious spirit from entering the city. The human head represented intelligence, the bull's body strength, and the wings freedom. For the Assyrians, these beings contained within themselves all of life, a fusion of the human, the earthly, and the divine. Imagine arriving here for the first time after weeks of travel across desert or mountains, and coming face to face with these silent guardians who seem to watch every person passing beneath their shadow. The impression must have been unforgettable, and that was precisely the intention. Passing through the walls and entering the citadel, we reach the heart of Assyrian power, the palace Sennacherib, called the Palace Without Rival, and the name was no casual exaggeration. This palatial complex was of extraordinary dimensions, with at least 80 rooms whose walls were lined with stone panels carved in bas relief. Kilometers of sculpted reliefs ran along corridors and chambers, depicting military campaigns, sieges of enemy cities, the transport of the Lamassu themselves, tribute processions, and hunting scenes. The main doors were flanked by colossal winged bulls, and the floor of the throne room was paved in stone. The materials used in its construction included ivory, ebony, cedar, and cypress, brought from the farthest corners of the empire. The palace foundation was built from millions of bricks, laid in layers reaching considerable height, creating an elevated platform upon which the entire structure stood. For anyone who entered, each step revealed greater complexity and greater power. A carefully designed progression meant to overwhelm visitors before they reached the king's presence. Beside the throne room stood a bath paved in stone, and the great antechamber contained rows of carved orthostats depicting the monarch's achievements. The reliefs that decorated the palace walls are perhaps Nineveh's most extraordinary artistic legacy. In them we see scenes of remarkable precision and detail. Assyrian soldiers besieging fortified cities, prisoners led away in long lines, war chariots advancing over rough terrain, and above all, the famous lion hunts. The lion represented for the Assyrians everything dangerous and untamable in the natural world, and the king's ability to confront and defeat it was proof of his divine right to rule. In some panels, the lions appear wounded, twisting in expressions the sculptors captured with startling, almost moving realism, revealing an artistic sensitivity that contrasts with the brutality celebrated in other scenes. Military campaigns are shown with equal detail, including siege engines, assault ramps, archers and spearmen in formation, and captured cities being plundered. One of the most famous series depicts the Siege of Lachish, a fortified city of Judah, with such accuracy that archaeologists have corroborated the representation with findings at the site itself. These reliefs were not merely decoration, they were propaganda carved in stone, a permanent message that the order of the world depended on the power of the king of Assyria. Beside the palace stretched the royal gardens, and here the story becomes especially fascinating. Sennacherib described in his own inscriptions having created an elevated garden beside the palace, imitating the mountains of Amanus, planted with all kinds of aromatic trees, fruit trees, and species brought from Babylon and the highlands. The palace reliefs depict these gardens as lush spaces where water flows through channels crossing the landscape. Different kinds of trees grow on raised terraces, and an aqueduct pours water from the top of a hill. To keep these gardens alive in the dry climate of Mesopotamia, the king built a canal system extending more than 50 kilometers into the mountains, including a limestone aqueduct near the locality of Jerwan, built with more than 2 million carved blocks and waterproof cement, centuries before the Romans perfected similar techniques. Sennacherib proudly described how he directed a watercourse across great distances to the vicinity of Nineveh and constructed an aqueduct of white limestone blocks over steep valleys. Some researchers have proposed that these gardens of Nineveh, and not those of Babylon, were in fact the legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, arguing that classical authors confused the two cities over the centuries. If that theory is correct, what we are reconstructing here would be one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements of antiquity, attributed for millennia to the wrong city. Let us now turn to another of Nineveh's treasures, one that could not be seen from the walls, but may have had a more enduring impact than any palace or garden. In the palace rooms, stored on shelves that no longer exist, lay a collection of more than 30,000 clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform script. What we now know as the Library of Ashurbanipal, named after Sennacherib's grandson who greatly expanded it, was the largest and most comprehensive collection of knowledge assembled in the ancient world up to that time. Until the Library of Alexandria, no other collection would rival it in scope and ambition. It contained texts on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, divination, religious rituals, diplomatic correspondence, administrative records, hymns, prayers, and literature. Among its tablets was a version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, considered the oldest surviving literary work, including a flood narrative that bears striking resemblance to the story of Noah in the Bible. Ashurbanipal, unlike many warrior kings, had been trained as a scribe and valued knowledge as a form of power. He sent agents throughout the empire to collect tablets, and when he conquered Babylon, he carried off entire libraries as spoils, bringing captive Babylonian scribes to work in the royal archives. The result was a repository of knowledge that, ironically, survived because of the very fire that destroyed the city. The burning of Nineveh baked the clay tablets, hardening them and preserving them so that we could read them more than 2,500 years later. Beyond palaces and libraries, Nineveh was also a living city, full of daily activity. Bustling markets spread near the river dock and in commercial districts where one could find flatbreads stuffed with lamb, cheeses, fresh fruits, honey cakes, dates brought from the southern Chaldean lands, and even local delicacies such as roasted locusts served on sticks and river carp grilled with spices. Taverns flourished throughout the city, especially those in the northeast and near the dock, many of them offering live music, though those in the merchants' quarter were said to be dangerous after dark. Artisans worked ivory, metal, and pottery in workshops that produced everything from everyday objects to luxury pieces destined for the palace. Scribes copied texts in rooms connected to temples, preserving knowledge on wet clay with their reed styluses. Transport boats and local gondolas served as means of movement along the canals that crossed the city. Rental mules and donkeys were available at numerous points for those who preferred to travel by land. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis where deported peoples from conquered lands, merchants from distant regions, garrison soldiers, and an imperial bureaucracy coexisted, maintaining the functioning of a state that stretched for thousands of kilometers. At the center of Nineveh's spiritual life stood the Temple of Ishtar, whose worship in this location dated back millennia before the Assyrians made it their capital. This temple was rebuilt and embellished by successive kings and functioned not only as a religious center, but as an economic institution with its own lands, livestock, and personnel. Other temples dedicated to deities such as Sin, Nergal, Shamash, and Nabu completed the sacred landscape of the city. For the inhabitants of Nineveh, these spaces formed the link between the human and the divine, places where rituals maintained cosmic order and ensured the prosperity of the empire. The ziggurats, those step towers rising toward the sky, shaped the city's skyline and could be seen from kilometers away, a visual signal both to travelers and to the gods to whom they were dedicated. The biblical connection of Nineveh adds another layer to its history. According to the book of Jonah, God sent the prophet to this city to warn its inhabitants of imminent destruction because of their wickedness. The text describes Nineveh as a city so great that it required 3 days to cross, with more than 120,000 people. According to the account, the city repented at Jonah's preaching and was spared. But the prophecies did not end there. The prophet Nahum, writing likely decades later, devoted his entire book to foretelling the total destruction of Nineveh, describing armies with red shields advancing toward a city that once dominated the entire Near East. For the peoples who had suffered under Assyrian rule, who had seen their cities plundered, their populations deported, and their temples desecrated, the fall of Nineveh would not be merely a military event, but an act of justice, balancing generations of oppression. And that fall came. After the death of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, the empire began to unravel in a series of devastating civil wars. Peoples who had been subjugated for generations saw their opportunity. A coalition of Babylonians under King Nabopolassar and Medes under King Cyaxares marched toward the heart of the empire. In the summer of 612 before Christ, the allied armies laid siege to Nineveh. For 3 months, the walls that had seemed invincible held firm. But eventually, according to some sources, torrential rains caused the river to swell and undermine part of the defenses, and the attackers broke into the city. What followed was weeks of plunder. The Assyrian king died during the siege. The temples were stripped of silver and gold. The palaces were set ablaze. The population that could not flee to the last Assyrian strongholds in the north was massacred or deported to the countryside. Archaeologists found skeletons of defenders among the ruins, silent testimony to those final moments. The fall of Nineveh shocked the ancient world. From distant Greece, the poet Phocylides reflected that a small, well-ordered city is stronger than a foolish Nineveh. Babylon became the new imperial center of Mesopotamia for the first time in more than 1,000 years. Within a few decades, the largest city in the world lay so desolate that later travelers passed by its ruins without knowing what they had once been. Now I want to bring you to the present and show you what these places look like today. Thank you for being here. And if you have ideas or suggestions for future cities, share them in the comments. Let's begin. The ruins of Nineveh lie today on the outskirts of the city of Mosul in northern Iraq, on the eastern bank of the Tigris. The archaeological site is dominated by two large mounds, Kuyunjik, where the palaces of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal once stood, and Tel Nebi Yunus, where Islamic tradition places the tomb of the prophet Jonah. The city walls, which once extended for 12 kilometers, are still partially visible, though a significant portion of the site has been covered by the urban expansion of Mosul, with residential neighborhoods built directly over what were once Assyrian streets and buildings. The remains of the palace without rival were discovered in the 1840s by the British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, whose excavations brought to light the reliefs and lamassu that are now displayed in the British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris, and other museums around the world. The library of Ashurbanipal was found shortly afterward by Hormuzd Rassam, Layard's Iraqi assistant, and the more than 30,000 tablets were transported to London, where a young banknote engraver named George Smith discovered among the fragments the story of the flood, a revelation that electrified the 19th century academic world and was even attended by the British Prime Minister. Nineveh's recent history has been particularly painful. Between 2014 and 2017, during the occupation by the Islamic State, parts of the archaeological site were deliberately destroyed. Militants demolished with jackhammers and bulldozers a lamassu that had stood at the Nergal Gate for more than 2,700 years. They blew up the mosque that stood over the tomb of the prophet Jonah and excavated hundreds of meters of tunnels beneath the mound to loot antiquities and finance their war. The destruction was devastating, but it had an unexpected consequence. Those same tunnels, once Mosul was liberated, revealed an Assyrian palace that had remained hidden for millennia, including reliefs of lamassu and processions of women that had never been seen before. Today, international archaeological teams from Italy, Germany, and the United States are working alongside Iraqi authorities to restore and protect what remains. The Adad Gate, which for decades was one of the most visible symbols of the ancient city along one of Mosul's main roads, has been reconstructed as part of a new archaeological park with pathways, a visitor center, and informational panels about the history of Nineveh. The people of Mosul, who grew up seeing these walls and gates as part of their everyday landscape, are now witnessing a revival of their heritage. Recently, on the mound of Nebi Yunus, archaeologists uncovered the largest lamassu ever found. A sculpture approximately 6 meters high that once guarded the throne room of King Esarhaddon. Nearly 2,700 years after its creation, the giant guardian has resumed its purpose, radiating the power and majesty of a civilization whose history continues to captivate the world. I truly appreciate that you watch this. Your ideas, comments, and constructive opinions shape what comes next. Do not hesitate to leave a comment below. Until next time.